Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jacob Scher. I'm Director of Global Strategy and Advocacy for the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C. And I want to welcome you to another beautiful day in Aspen and the start, I'm sure, of another great day at the Aspen Environmental Forum. Our topic this morning will be Rio +20 and the making of the green economy. We've had a really rich discussion over the last 2 days about the many challenges that face us in a world of 7 billion people. And we're at a moment in the history of our species on this planet, if we're willing to look clearly and courageously, it's quite obvious that we are pushing up, if not exceeding, our planet's boundaries. The capacity of our Earth to absorb our pollution, the capacity of our planet to meet our ever-growing needs. Next year, in 2012, the world will go to Rio de Janeiro to discuss these challenges, the ones that we've been discussing here in Aspen over the last few days, and hopefully we'll go to Rio to make real progress, to take real action, to move us towards a more sustainable future. With me, I have a wonderful group of panelists. And we're going to be talking about the prospects for what is called officially the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, which will be held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on June 4th to 6th in 2012. It's also called Rio +20 and sometimes Earth Summit 2012. I'd like to start off with a little bit of audience participation and ask you a few questions. I'd like to know how many of you were actually in Rio in 1992 for the Earth Summit? Okay. 3. Okay, all right. How many of you remember, even vaguely, the 1992 Earth Summit? Okay, all right. And then the final question, which is a little bit impolite, but I think important, and one that I've been asking a lot of groups when I talk about this subject is, how old were you in 1992? And I raise that question because I think it gives you a perspective of what 20 years is. In the context of our own lives, it can be seen as a very, very brief period, or in some ways a very long period. But I think it's also useful to think a little bit about how much the world has changed in the last 20 years, and then to think forward about how the world could change for both either good or bad in the next 20 years. I was in Rio in 1992, at this time, almost exactly 19 years ago. It was an extraordinarily exciting time. For the first 2 weeks of June in 1992, Rio was the environmental capital of the Earth. It was the largest gathering of presidents and prime ministers in history. There were 110 of them. And they had a meeting with an extraordinary amount of harmony and a lot of agreement on the need to reconcile, on the one hand, the need to increase the well-being of human beings, and on the other hand, the need to protect and preserve our environment. It was an extraordinarily productive meeting. It resulted in the signing of 2 major treaties, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Framework Convention on Biodiversity. The 162 nations in attendance there also agreed to a document called Agenda 21, which is often referred to as a blueprint for sustainable development. It's about 400 pages long, and it contains roughly 4,000 recommendations for societies to move their own countries and their own nations to a more sustainable path. The meeting also produced 2 new institutions. The Global Environmental Facility, which is often thought as the green window of the World Bank. It's an important UN institution that provides financing for developing countries to meet some of the global environmental challenges, such as climate change and biodiversity. And it also led to the creation of the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, which was supposed to monitor and encourage the implementations of the commitments made in Rio to sustainable development. So here we are 20 years later. In some ways we've seen some real progress, and I think we won't get into it again, but I think as we've heard over the last 2 days, there's still a lot of problems. And let me just tick off a few of the changes, which I think are important in the last 20 years. There are 1 billion more people today than there were in 1992. There are 1 billion more people living in urban areas than there were in 1992. We've seen hundreds of millions of people come out of poverty, out of dire poverty. We've seen real progress in a number of environmental areas. One that I worked on was we've actually seen in the 90s the almost complete phase-out of leaded gasoline worldwide. We've also seen a huge increase in connectivity on the planet. I can remember being in Rio in 1992 and being amazed that I could call my wife from Rio de Janeiro on this device called a cell phone, but I wasn't really sure if they were really going to take off. But today, there are 5 billion cell phone contracts on the planet. There are 1.7 billion people attached to the internet, and about 1 billion people that are involved in Facebook and other social media. So the world we have today is one that is more connected. A lot of the environmental challenges that we talked about in Rio are much real. In 1992, climate change was really, for many people, an abstraction. Today, it's a real challenge that we have to learn how to mitigate and adapt to. So now I'd like to turn to our first speaker, who is Amy Frankel, and she is the Regional Director for North America for the United Nations Environment Program in Washington, D.C. I'm really thrilled to have Amy here because she's representing UNEP, which has been a real thought leader in the process as we move towards the Earth Summit next year, and really talking about the green economy, about really the need to sort of transform the way we think about economics so that we can truly value resources and truly assure a sustainable future. So, Amy, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob, and good morning, everyone. I'm very, very pleased that this issue is being discussed at the conference, and in fact, David Monsma started off the conference by talking about Rio. So as Jacob said, this will be the anniversary of the 1992 summit in Rio de Janeiro, but also 40 years after the Stockholm meeting. So some people refer to it as Stockholm plus 40. And if we have another one, our executive director likes to joke, it'll be like Paris minus 20, or, you know. Anyway. We've heard a lot about the challenges facing the world in terms of population growth, environmental tipping points coming close or even at that point now. And what we're trying to do on this panel, I think, is to look at some of the solutions. The fact is, the good news is, we have most of the technology and know-how in this room and beyond about what needs to be done and how we can do it. And now what we need is action. We need to find a political opportunity, which the Rio meeting presents, to move some of this agenda forward, practical solutions. And so I see it really as an opportunity for the world to come together, use this moment in a meeting that is less polarized than, for example, the climate change negotiations, and really roll up our sleeves and get down to the solutions. So UNEP, as Jacob mentioned, and you should find on your tables, this is our synthesis report on the green economy. And the full report is several hundred pages long. It's on the internet. We save trees by not printing it. And we invite you to come look at it, where it really lays out a macroeconomic case for how we can shift our business-as-usual scenarios to a green economy. We have really two aspects of it, two fundamental pieces of the green economy. The overarching theme of it, or the philosophy of it, is that we have to make the case for how to reconcile the need for economic growth to address the poverty that still exists in the world and the lack of access to fresh water and a basic standard of living, with the fact that we cannot exceed planetary boundaries. What we see is that there has been a huge misallocation of capital, especially natural capital, that has been largely unaccounted for. So I'm just going to give you a couple of the key findings of the report and really invite you to take a look at the details both in your report on the table and online. First finding is that investing just 2% of global GDP in 10 key sectors can move us towards a low-carbon, resource-efficient economy. And the 10 sectors include some of the obvious ones, including energy, transport, water, waste management, agriculture. Second, very important finding is that greening the economy not only would generate growth, but also will produce a higher growth in GDP and GDP per capita in a scenario 5 to 10 years over business as usual. A third finding is that the green economy, very importantly, values and invests in natural capital. And we have a chart in this report on your table that shows over time the benefits to the natural environment of this new way forward. And it's really remarkable to show, the conservation results of this approach, which is necessary for future well-being. And finally, very critical, is that a green economy can contribute to poverty alleviation. In particular, it's kind of the reverse of what people conventionally think, which is that a clean environment is just a luxury for the rich. We really make the economic case that it is a necessity for the poor, especially in countries, the least developed countries, that rely on natural goods for their direct economic well-being. Now, the good news is that we're already on our way. And we've talked in this meeting about some of the big examples, China and India, leading on renewable energy investments. But there's other countries, including some represented here, are taking steps. Kenya, where UNEP is headquartered, has just instituted a feed-in tariff policy, which for the first time is providing the right incentives to move away from fossil fuel reliance and towards using its resources there, geothermal and hydro. South Africa has launched a process to develop a national green economy plan. Brazil, in the state of Sao Paulo, developed a green economy plan with targets and indicators. So there's a great deal of reason for optimism. However, there are obviously tremendous challenges ahead for all countries that are facing this. The first is the political realities, the short-term political realities of how do you make the case for the kind of investment we need up front to move us there, given the current financial crisis and some of the attitudes towards the issues of climate change and so forth. And the last challenge that I think is critical to this is translating these global agreements and the things that have happened before into implementation on the ground, at the national level, at the local level. And it really comes down to communication and making the connections, for example, between the Environment Ministry and the Finance Ministry. And we're doing some work particularly in Africa. It's called our Poverty and Environment Initiative, where we sit down with the Finance and Development Ministries and the Environment Ministry, Energy Ministries, and work out a 5-year plan for development that takes into account the natural environment. That's been really game-changing to do that. And so we're going to need to continue to have the right hand talking to the left hand to make sure that these ideals are actually translated into action.
Thank you very much, Amy. Now we're going to turn to Ambassador Yawn Liason. He is a former foreign minister and a former president of the United Nations General Assembly, but he is also very much now the chairman of WaterAid Sweden and serves as an advocate for the Millennium Development Goals and was appointed in that position by the UN Secretary General. He is a representative of the nation of Sweden, and he reminds us that really it's not Rio plus 20, it's really Stockholm plus 40. And what I'm going to ask Ambassador Eliason to talk about is really one of the other major themes of the Earth Summit next year. It's really the challenge of how do we govern our planet? How do we manage the Earth, given the fact that right now sort of responsibility is sort of divvied up between 192 totally independent sovereign nations, which is a challenge in itself. And secondly, you have many, many other important players, multinational corporations, international agencies, civil society organizations that aren't formally represented in the process. So this challenge of governance is a huge one, and I'm really delighted that Ambassador Eliason is here to give us his thoughts about how we meet that challenge.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I'm glad you reminded us of Stockholm. It shows how long ago we started to discuss these issues. I was involved, of course, as you understand, it was a serious case of child labor, but I was there, and we've been struggling with this issue for far too long. listening to Amy's points here, I just concluded something we should conclude, all of us, I think, is that going in the direction of the green economy is not only the right thing to do from all kinds of reasons that lead or are the basis for our values, but it's also a good business. It's the enlightened self-interest. And that is why this meeting is important, that we can perhaps both combine coming to the conclusion that this is the right thing to do, but it's also in the enlightened self-interest to go this direction. I have a sense that the green economy is a little bit like the change of the industrial economy into the service economy, which has happened over the last 25, 30 years or so. And we are in that transition too. And I think it's, again, in the interest also of business and everyone to catch on and realize that it combines ideals with realistic expectations for the self-interest. Jacob, you had a good line when we had breakfast. You said you saw a sign. This was in reference to the bank crisis in the United States, that the planet is too big to fail. I like that. But also I would say that this meeting is too big to fail. And I say this because the Copenhagen meeting, we may have different views. We discussed that also at breakfast. To me, was a disappointment. And it was a disappointment from several directions, that we had high expectations, and in the end, some realized that they had to lower expectations, and then you had the problems of people not realizing that they didn't have to deliver. But with the high expectations that still were there, you saw the disappointment, and not least many of the activists around the world on the environmental, the climate change front were extremely disappointed. And I think I won't go into the analysis of why it worked out as it did, and I was disappointed. But I think one of the reasons is you hinted that, Amy, that you had now contacts between the environment ministers and the finance ministers. And I know for a fact that when these issues reached the prime ministers of the world and the presidents, they were taken aback. My God, had the environmental ministers been talking about all these things? And they asked the ministers of finance, did you talk to the minister of finance? Did you talk to the minister of industry? Did you talk to the minister of agriculture? Did you talk to me earlier? But this is a revolutionary thing to do. And that's why you saw this picture, with the old leaders sitting confused in the middle of the night in Copenhagen. It was rather symptomatic of how this process actually had failed. So therefore, I think we have to look at these global issues, global challenges, global problems, from the perspective that actually we don't have global solutions, of course, yet, I would hope, I could add, but we don't have efficient global institutions to deal with these problems. And this is a very serious matter, because historically we now have the global issues dominating not only the global scene, but also coming back to the regions, to the nations, and to the local communities. So global and local is the same thing. And how are we then organized? Well, we know from our own countries, most of us are coming from democracies, that we have the democratic structure based on the nation state. But the problems are global. So the trick is what I said yesterday. Most of you were here, I hope, and maybe remember even, that I said that the good international solution must in the end be seen as a national interest. That's the direction we have to go. Again, coming back to the enlightened self-interest. And for that to happen, I think we have to reduce the expectations on the different actors, but also the UN particularly, because there has to be a mobilization of efforts by all who can influence the problems. Again, I said yesterday, put the problem in the center, and then ask yourselves who are affected by the problem and who can then influence the problem. This means that what I hope this meeting, we will come back in the second round, but I hope the meeting will be a catalyst for action by all who can contribute. And this means the UN, and here UNEP has done a great job. Achim Steiner, the leader of UNEP, is a visionary and a very practically oriented man, I hope he plays an important role in this conference. But then you have the regional organizations, in my case, the European Union, which has tremendous resources and also now more muscle to act. You have the nation states, the government, you have the parliament, you have the industry, the private sector, you have the civil society, you have universities, research, you and me. And by identifying what then each actor can do, we can then have a realistic assumption of what can be achieved and divide up the work. Shared responsibility, international division of labor. And I think that's why Copenhagen failed, because there was a tremendous expectation that this big meeting on this high level was going to deliver the final formula. No, not final, but the best formula for progress, and that wasn't done. But we now have to think in terms of division of labor. But we'll come back to that, I guess, Jacob.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to turn to Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka. Okay. And who I'm really going to ask probably some of the hardest questions. Phumzile was the former deputy president of South Africa. In 2002, she was South Africa's Minister of Minerals and Energy, and 2002 was the year that Johannesburg hosted the last World Summit on Sustainable Development. Some people refer to that meeting, the Johannesburg meeting, as the Down to Earth Summit, because the subject there was how do you translate the lofty goals that are agreed by in international negotiations and treaties and plans and action to really concrete actions on the ground. So what I'm going to ask Phumzile to talk about is the real challenges of how you work in a society like South Africa to move a country towards greater sustainability.
Thanks. Well, that event, one of the things that stands out for me is what Greenpeace did. We had South Africa's energy mix is predominantly coal. We have a little bit of nuclear, a little bit of renewables, which we're trying to increase significantly, and a little bit of hydro, and natural gas, which we use for gas to liquid. And as would happen in every other country, your nuclear facilities are supposed to be your prime security areas. A very clever person from Greenpeace had been able to come and associate with the plant and worked there, and planned that on the day of the opening of the summit, they would scale up one of the protection towers and hang the Greenpeace flag, which showed that our security was nothing. So there I was looking important, TV and everything, and suddenly there was this news about what had happened. And of course, the activists were all around. So that was, for me, one of the things. I think in any other country, I probably would have lost my job for sleeping on the job. But anyway, on the more serious side, what was interesting and important for us in that summit, and I don't think just for South Africa, but for many countries, was trying to sort out our own national understanding and buy-in as countries to the many goals that we're committing ourselves to. I couldn't agree more with what Jan was saying about the importance of having agreement within the actors. In my situation in our country, not being the lead minister for environment needed to make sure that every cluster in cabinet understands what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve and buys in. And I think in many situations, when we haven't done that, we may find that we go into an international conference as a country and we all have different ideas about what is it that we have come to do. And we also have to then also go back and bring in members of society in our own countries, industries, academics, etc. And that takes a lot of time because, as you can understand, there are many interests in those constituencies. But I would say even as we move forward and plan for the next big event, people need to go back and do their homework in their own countries. Because I think the discourse that we tend to see globally, has a lot to do with the discourse that we bring as delegations from different countries. Also, something that we discussed a lot in the last few days here, the importance of integrating the issues that we are discussing. I think that a purist green movement is, in a way, detrimental to what is being achieved. And being able to bring in and to make a lot of people who represent different interests, women, health activists, etc., to see that their issues are key to the success of the event is one also important. In the WSSD, I think many countries try to do that. I certainly know that in South Africa, we spent more time outside what you'd call the strict environmental lobby, but with people that you'd say are peripheral to the issue. And I think that really helped us a lot to hold the summit together. I think I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you very much. Over the last few weeks ago, I was in Washington speaking to a group of college students about international environmental issues, and I posed a question to them. I said, could you name the 3 big international events that are going to occur in Rio de Janeiro over the next 5 years that should attract the attention of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people? So somebody immediately raised their hand and said, oh yeah, they're going to have the World Cup in Rio in 2014. And then somebody said, oh yeah, they're going to have the Olympics in Rio in 2016. And then I said, but there's a third one. And so there was a big pause, and I said, it's going to be the Earth Summit in 2012. And as important as those 2 big sporting events are, I think getting the leadership of the planet together to talk about the future of human civilization might be even more important. And then one young fellow raised his hand and said, oh, no, Mr. Scher, the World Cup is more important. But anyway, I tell that story to introduce our next, to begin the introduction of our next speaker, Gianni Zimmer, who is the General Manager for Capital Projects Development with responsibility for sustainability for the multinational mining corporation Vale, which is headquartered in Rio de Janeiro. And she's going to talk a little bit about her company and their commitment to sustainability. But given the fact that Rio will be in the spotlight starting next summer and for the next 5 years, and the country of Brazil will be in the spotlight, that to really get her reaction about what this meeting will mean, not only for her company and for the industry, but also for her country.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. Just a small note on the program. Vânia Somavila was supposed to be here. She was our head of the sustainability department. Last week she was promoted to a very senior position within our company, so then that's why I'm actually here. And we were actually very happy with this because she came from the sustainability area, and now she's taking a very high and senior position in the company, which is a very good indication on how now our company is caring more and more for sustainable issues. I'm actually living in Rio de Janeiro, the city where we're going to hold this conference. So it's a very pretty city. In case you intend or making arrangements to go and be there, then you have the excuse to go for the conference and take the opportunity of actually being in Rio de Janeiro, which is wonderful not only for the landscape and beaches and music, but also, I believe, the people. Very easygoing and extrovert people. I'm sure you're going to enjoy being there. So hopefully you can make it to the conference and be able to be there. But you might be wondering, why is a mining company here today? Well, we believe that the big corporations like our corporation are at the very heart of the sustainability issues. But actually, I believe only few companies like our company would accept to be here. So I'm very brave to be here today to debate with you all. But actually, I'm very proud to be part of a company that wants to better understand, to learn, and do things in a better way. Then what is Vale? According to The Economist magazine of last September of last year, Vale is the largest multinational company you've never heard of. Actually, please raise your hands, those of you who have heard of Vale before. So I guess economists is sort of right, huh? Yes. But we are the second largest mining company, diversified mining company in the world. Or according to Forbes, we are number 1 already. And our new CEO, Mr. Murilo Ferreira, was just pointing out that that is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we want to do, or we want to be recognized as the best in what we are doing. Not the largest company, but the best in our goals. And our goals do not only include making profits, revenues, which of course are so much appreciated by our shareholders, but also doing things in the right way. And what does that mean? Doing things in the right way meaning for us to also look into the social impacts, the environmental impacts, into our own operations, our current operations, and also on our future projects. But why do we care? I can say that even though Vale is present in 38 countries today, we are originally a Brazilian company, and our globalization process just started very recently. And in Brazil, all the 3 pillars of sustainability are quite relevant. I can say that the country is abundant in natural resources. We have 20% of the world's species. We have 14% of the world's fresh water. 60% of the entire Amazon is within Brazilian boundaries. 10% of our land is protected. And let's not forget, Brazil is the 5th largest country in terms of territory. In terms of economic achievements, Brazil has enjoyed economic stability despite of the global crisis. GDP has grown steadily over the past years, 5 to 6%. The country is now the 6th largest economy of the world in terms of GDP. But despite of all our resources, growth, and prosperity, unfortunately, Brazil has an uneven distribution of wealth, one of the worst in the continent. 20% of our population does not know how to read or write. 45% of the municipalities in the country have very low levels of development indices. And we can say we are a country of 190 million people, 8.5% of people living below the poverty line. So the biggest challenge that we face as a country is how to improve people's lives. That brings us to the key issue that we believe we will be focusing on Rio Plus 20. That is how to develop a model where natural capital is maintained or even enlarged, while social capital, the institutions, technical capital, infrastructure, and human capital grow. So I think that's the challenge. And I tend to agree with our colleagues here, what they just said, that I think this conference can be a catalyst for action. But we have to identify what each of one of us can do, including companies or including people like us as citizens, everybody, government. And then we have to share responsibilities. And I think the key word that we believe is cooperation. I think we cannot do alone. A company cannot do alone. A person cannot do alone. The government cannot do alone. So we got to have cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yawn. Our final speaker will be Kit Batten, who is the Global Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Agency for International Development.
U.S. Not UNEP.
Oh, I'm sorry, forgive me. U.S. Agency for, I can get in a lot of trouble for that. U.S. Agency for International Development. And Kim, as we've heard, climate change clearly is very high on the global agenda, and as Yawn indicated before, there has been a tremendous amount of disappointment associated with the failure to reach a treaty deal in Copenhagen. And so what I would like Kit to do is to talk about where we are on the climate discussions and to sort of kind of give us a sense of what we might expect to happen at Rio next year to kind of move that discussion forward.
Thanks, Jacob. I'm going to take a little bit of opportunity here to cast the U.S.'s position a little bit on what we're doing with respect to climate change and the green economy and sustainable growth, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail about how the UNFCCC process is moving forward and how that process is different from the Rio process. So President Obama has said that we can't achieve a safer, more prosperous and democratic world when 3 out of 10 people are living in extreme poverty. And clearly, we need to be investing in sustainable economic growth for these people, and that can't be done at all costs. The President's recent global development policy recognizes that sustainable development is crucial for broad-based economic growth, and that sustainable development must include investments in innovation, the private sector, donor coordination, and very importantly, an analysis of the impact of our investments. Because if we don't do that analysis, we can't see how successful we're being. So there is one of the 3 major initiatives that the President has launched is the Global Climate Change Initiative. And that initiative is U.S. government-wide, and USAID is an important player in that initiative. We're committed, as the government, to sustainable low-carbon economic development that's also climate resilient. And we're working on that through investments in adaptation, in what we're calling sustainable landscapes, which is really about making sure that we're investing in ecosystems that can store carbon and provide many other important ecosystem services, and then also in clean energy. So all of this work that's being done by the U.S. government feeds into both the challenges and the opportunities presented to move towards a global path for green economy at Rio+20. This clearly will require coordination from the public sector, but we can't do it alone, just as the private sector can't do it alone. And we're working with not only multinational companies, but also small and medium businesses and individual entrepreneurs. We also can't do it without the civil society organizations and without really including making sure that there are seats at the table for youth, for women and girls, and for other traditionally underrepresented groups. We also, of course, need to be emphasizing tools for getting this all done, including good governance, transparency, and inclusiveness. So to take a step and talk a little bit about where we are with respect to the UNFCCC, I would disagree respectfully with the ambassador that Copenhagen was a failure. There were many successes. It didn't turn out necessarily the way that we all had high expectations for it to. But my colleagues at the State Department, including Todd Stern, who's the Special Envoy for Climate Change and the lead negotiator for the United States, certainly are working very hard to make sure that we're continuing to make progress leading into the Durban conference at the end of this year. So you all know how contentious the UNFCCC process is. And so given that level of contentiousness, we're not looking to try and renegotiate climate change as part of the Rio+20 meeting, mostly because we don't think that that would help the Rio+20 meeting succeed. By bringing that contentiousness to the table, we could really block a lot of progress. However, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of important climate change considerations and work to be done. We can't make advancements in terms of human development or low-carbon economic growth, water issues, biodiversity issues, any number, social equity issues, et cetera, without also considering climate change. And as Amy said earlier, this really is an opportunity to be practical and show some progress about integrating climate change considerations, both mitigation and adaptation opportunities, economic growth opportunities, in a way that we can demonstrate progress moving forward. And I think that that could actually be helpful to the overall UNFCCC process as well.
Great, thank you. I've noted on a number of occasions that our chief climate negotiator, Todd Stern, has made the point that if we're going to deal with climate change, you're really going to have to deal with sustainable development, and you will not achieve sustainable development unless we deal with climate change. So these two subjects are very, very much interrelated. At this stage, I'd like to pose two questions to all our panelists and to you in the audience, which are, one, what in your mind would make the Rio Earth Summit, Rio Plus 20, a success? And then secondly, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 results or deliverables, concrete actions that should come out of the Rio Plus 20 meeting 1 year from now? So can I go ahead and open this up for the panelists? You want to start?
Sure, thanks. If you've never been to one of these conferences, there's sort of 3 categories, I like to call them, of outcomes that one could anticipate. One is sort of the high-level political statements that I think we will surely see out of this conference, where the heads of delegations will come together and negotiate some kind of a statement or text that comes out of it with aspirations and agreement towards the future. And my hope, both as a citizen and caring environmentalist as well as representative of the UN Environment Program, is that kind of a statement will really recognize the place that we are currently, things that we've talked about at this conference, the need to address poverty while needing to recognize planetary boundaries, and the need for fundamental shift away from business as usual. So statements to that effect to move us forward, and that groups can then hang their hats on for implementation going forward, I think are very helpful. Second, there's what I call policy commitments, like the Millennium Development Goals or targets, saying we agree to these specific things. And there are a lot of things that can be done to translate what we need to do into action. I've heard ideas during the conference which have been very helpful. For example, looking at alternative measures, parallel measures to GDP, looking at full cost accounting or whatever the new term is for it, but basically taking into account fully the externalities and costs of the environment in all that governments do, both in terms of development policy from, for example, we heard from USAID, development planning if you're a recipient of donor aid, looking at private sector accounting sheets, and how do you really account for the cost fully. Third kind of outcome is what the focus of the World Summit in Joburg was, which was on partnerships. Those can be non-governmental initiatives, private sector, public, NGO, or public-private. There's all kinds of ways to move things forward. And again, I've heard a lot of good ideas here, including looking at the need to better mobilize investment in clean technology, better connect the different actors that are out there to provide best practices, mobilize capital. Another area I've heard discussed here is at the cities level. Given the compelling case to act at the city level, that most people are living there now in urban areas, and we're going to grow to 600 cities with more than 1 million people by 2030, accounting for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. We've got to look at how to make cities more sustainable. Another area that's discussed often are the oceans. And the oceans, though they cover 71% of the planet, it just still surprises me that many people just don't think about the oceans as part of the environment. Yet, clearly, they are, and the resources we get from them, including our fisheries, are critical to our well-being. The one other point I want to make is, there are outcomes, but how do we get there? I just want to give you some very specific information about how you can actually make a difference in the outcomes of this conference. The first is that governments, of course, are all pulling their official positions together, and you can try to talk to your governments. I think most governments, I know the U.S. And Canada, which we interact with from the region, have a process for getting civil society and private sector input. So that's one way. Another is to give your ideas as organizations or as citizens directly to the UN process. The process is being led out of the Secretariat in New York, and they've set a deadline of November 1st for getting ideas. But you don't have to wait. In fact, I think the sooner that ideas start getting out on the table, the better for having a discussion to rally around. And in fact, I know that Pew Environment Group has already put a position paper on the table for oceans that they shared in the UN, so I believe every country in the UN General Assembly has already received that. Third is to come to UNEP. UNEP is very engaged in this process. We were asked by the General Assembly to contribute to the preparations of Rio +20, and in fact, out of our office in Washington, we're going to be holding a series of consultations, lots of discussions planned from now. In fact, I'm kicking it off in Toronto on Tuesday with a civil society discussion there, in Washington, probably on the West Coast. There's a Green Build conference coming up in Toronto, so there's many opportunities. Please contact us. You can find my information on the program. And finally, having discussions with the host country and Brazil and other developing countries in terms of what are the needs of those countries and how can we make this conference make a difference.
Well, I think, Amy, you said it all.
Not getting off that easy.
To Kit Batten, I just want to explain my disappointment. It wasn't so much that we didn't reach a legally binding document. It was more the fact that we didn't. It didn't serve as the catalyst for action among all other actors that need to be involved in the process. The preparations were aiming for that legal document, and 6 months before, they realized, most of us, that we couldn't deliver. And then there was confusion whether to play down expectations or keep expectations high. So that's why I think, to your question, that I hope that they would have a pretty solid, simple document that states some of the facts about the green economy, and then makes the case that this is a good thing to, the right thing to do, and the enlightened self-interest. That it would alleviate poverty, and that we can prove that. And that it would create jobs, which it also will. If this is the transition from the classical economy to the green economy, and relate that to the industrial economy, to the service economy, and how much jobs were provided and are being provided in the service sector, we can make that case as a sort of pretty down-to-earth, strong, final document. But then it would be fantastic if this meeting could be really a catalyst to say, nobody gets off the hook. Right. We all have responsibility. And then identify all those actors, have them there, and in a number of meetings and discussions, make sure that you see the holistic picture, that it all sticks together. That nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And that each sector has responsibility. We have far too long in this world pointed at someone else. There's someone else is developing, someone else who has to do it. UN, government, whatever. No. The responsibility lies with all of us in the different functions we are, and we should cooperate. So if that could be a new type of meeting, we could perhaps lift this hopelessness, this disappointment in the international system that I know as an old UN man, that people say, we won't deliver results. We have to make sure that we have norm setting, standards, setting the direction, but then that the real action will be done on other levels, the local level, the national level, the regional level, and by all the different actors. So with a sort of a great, strong document, and then a division of labor or shared responsibilities coming out of the meeting, that will provide some new, fresh air to the UN system and make us come to the realization that the good international solution is a national interest.
I completely agree with Yawn. One of the models that we've been talking about for this meeting would be the Clinton Global Initiative, where institutions are encouraged to come to the Global Initiative meeting each year and to make commitments to work in partnerships or in coalitions of the willing on specific issues. And over the last 5 years, they've generated about 2,000 commitments, about $70 billion of resources to work on a whole range of sustainability issues in about 70 countries. And so perhaps Rio de Janeiro and next year will be an opportunity to bring the Clinton Global Initiative up to scale. Instead of having 2,000 initiatives, we might have 20,000 or 2 million. There's also a way for each one of you to get involved. Earth Day Network has launched an effort called A Billion Acts of Green. You can look at it on their website. They have now about 150 million individual commitments to do something about the environment, and their goal is to get that number up to 1 billion. And I think those sorts of activities, I think, reflect what Yawn is saying, is that, we can no longer wait for just the top political leadership, the nations of the world, to sort of come up with a grand plan as a way of saving the world. And in fact, we have to figure out a way to encourage and inspire, enable people at every level of every society to take action on the challenges we've been talking about. Fuzumi?
I think for me, what I would hope we could do is to try and clinch a lot of the agreements before getting to Rio. I really think that it's important to get the homework right, to really go to Rio to sort of dot the I's and and do all of the nasty work. Not nasty work, but the tough work outside that, because once you get there, the time is very short, it's highly pressured, and that's why sometimes important things fall off the table, because people are catching planes and that kind of thing. So there are those realities. So what we could do between now and then, at country level, at regional level, is actually very, very important. We should be able to anticipate outcomes even before we get there. And then, of course, I would hope that we can also institutionalize the integrated approach, which we discussed a lot here. I think it's an idea whose time has come, and there couldn't be a better platform than that in order to adopt that, so that going forward, the issue of population is a given. The issue of impact on women is a given. The issue of inclusiveness and role and participation of young people is a given. The issue of addressing inequalities as part of solving the problem. Because, one of the challenges when you deal with the poor communities, their attitude is that, well, you want to solve this environmental issue of yours, and then once it's sorted out, we'll still remain with the same division where few of you will be consuming and a lot of us will be poor. So if we are able to integrate all of these big issues and try and carry those issues. So, that would be my hope.
Gianni?
Yes. I guess I can contribute a little bit from a company's perspective, because right there you would have the very high-level discussions on how to be greener and how to go the right direction. But again, how you get to real terms, how you transform all those ideas into action, concrete terms. I think that is one of the key things. And I think through the companies, I guess that can be done. If the companies start to believe, are encouraged, are inspired, have the attitude to believe that that's the right way to go, I think we have the first step. That convincing is not, like we were mentioning today and yesterday, something that you can really impose. You have to believe that's the right way to go. So I think that's the number one. And this conference in Rio can really inspire people, inspire companies to go the right way. So that's one of the great achievements. But besides that, when you go to real terms, companies, in order to make changes, they have to have access to credit. They have to have access to technology. And I have to say, and which is not Vale's case, because Vale is a very profitable organization. But if you think about small and medium-sized companies, they might be willing to go the right direction to be more sustainable, but they have to have access to credit. And I can talk about Brazil. Unfortunately, I cannot talk much about India or other developing countries, but I can say about Brazil that we have, for example, some of the companies there that would like very much to do more, but they have absolutely no access to credit. So I can give you an example about pig iron industry. Vale supplies iron ore to the pig iron industry. The pig iron industry in Brazil is probably one of the most unsustainable industries that you have. And they would like to be more sustainable. I talk to them. I know them quite well. But they have very low margins. They make very little profit. If they don't have access to credit, they go to the banks. The banks consider them too high of a risk. And yet, the government, society, everybody demands them to be more sustainable. So we got to figure out a way how we can make that happen, for example. This is just an example in real terms of an industry in Brazil, but you have several others. So I guess in technology, access to technology, I don't think right now we are in the state of the art in terms of the green technology. You have some technology available in some areas more than others, but we still have to do a lot because when a company is deciding, for example, about whether to go ahead or not with a project, then what you do is you make your calculations, you go through your valuations, and then you have internal rate of return, paybacks, and everything. Then you make a decision to pursue or not such investment. And clear today that when you try to engage more green technology into those calculations, it's much more expensive, and it's not so linear thinking how that can really pay back. So it's not just what I'm trying to say here. Then a decision to be more sustainable for a company cannot just be based on maths, on calculations, right? It has to be an attitude because today I don't think we have yet the technology or we are there where we can really say it really pays off if you just make calculations, okay? I'm not talking about the other things that we can have when you do that because you're affecting community, you have environmental side and everything. I'm talking about the pure calculation situation. So I think I had to mention that to you from a company's perspective. Yet, for example, I have to tell you that at Vale, we are trying to do one very interesting thing that we proposed and we are trying to develop that there could be some of the cases for Rio Plus 20, which is when we do new projects, we can, of course, have this normal calculation being done, but we are also trying to create some what we call internal rate of return for sustainability. So besides we calculate the regular rate of return, we also have another one that calculates the impact of natural resources on everything we do. And if we have a way to measure this, and when we put forward a project to be approved, if we can have also this calculation, I think it's very helpful for the corporations to say, I choose to pursue a project in a more expensive way because I want to include the green technology in there. I want to pursue things in a better way. We have a very big project right now being pursued in Brazil by Vale, which is another Carajás. It's in the northern part of Brazil in the state of Pará, where we have the Carajás project, which is our biggest project of iron ore. We have another one there. And what we're doing at the moment, we're substituting, for example, trucks by a belt conveyor. Then we won't have trucks in the operation. That means reducing 65 million liters of diesel per year. That means reducing 70% of carbon emissions. That costs over $100 million more. And we are doing that. That's an attitude. So we are hoping that we can show this a little bit in Rio Plus 20 so that we can inspire other companies that have access to credit like we do, that we have access to technology, to pursue that as well. And of course, but we have to realize that some of the medium and small companies won't have that access. Then we have to make sure that we create or inspire governments, we inspire to create new, for example, subsidies or transfer subsidies for the fossil fuels to renewables, for example. So we have to have a clear message from the government that this is also the right way to go. So not sure I have contributed much, but I think I have to give you this insight from a company's perspective, which is a very concrete one. And just would like to finalize saying that at the end of the day, again, the key to all this is cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thanks. I know I'm last after a long series of discussions, so I'll try and make this brief, and I'm looking forward to questions. So just really quickly, to follow up on what you just said, I think that it's also important to recognize that green technology is not always more expensive than traditional technology, especially when you look at life cycle costs. And so I know that those are the type of analyses that you're doing, and I'm glad that you brought up the importance, especially for upfront costs. In some cases, there is greater expense, and so credit in those cases is especially important, I think. Just to follow up on we've heard lots of great ideas for outcomes for the Rio Plus 20 meeting. I want to highlight a couple and add just a couple more thoughts. I agree with the ambassador that it is really an opportunity to catalyze hope and action and to fully recognize the opportunities associated with the green economy globally. And also, I think an important outcome would be to recognize that sustainable development is not just the purview of the environmental ministers. We're not really going to make progress without incorporating all elements of our partner country governments. I agree that a concise political document is an important outcome, but we need more than that. As Jacob was saying, we need commitments and actions, and those can be ranging across any number of different important areas: science and technology, education, eliminating barriers for trade in environmentally friendly services and goods, getting the underrepresented groups to the table, and, of course, committing to increase good governance, and many others. At USAID, we're about to release our climate change strategy this month, and it makes very clear that climate change is not just the action. We're not only acting on climate change with a group of climate change experts at USAID. We're making sure that climate change considerations are integrated across all of our development portfolio. Similarly, I think a good outcome of this meeting would be to recognize that environmental issues writ large are not just the purview of environmental experts, but are part of the development and green growth plans at large. And those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Okay. Just to make it clear that this subject is not only the purview of us sitting here on the stage. We really are eager to hear from all of you, and we're going to open the session up to your questions. We don't have a huge amount of time, so I encourage you to be relatively brief in posing your questions to the panels. Over here? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Steve Johnson, I'm finishing a book I call Integrity at Scale. My question is a simple one. Can climate change be fully halted without fully halting the consumption of fossil fuel energy?
Okay, why don't we take one or two more? We'll take a couple of them and we'll respond. Yeah, go ahead. Right there. Mm-hmm. What?
Yes.
Yeah, I like what you said about attitude. Now, I just want to know a little bit about what is the source of you mentioned that that's a company. The company's mindset is attitude. What was the source of the fine attitude that you talked about?
Okay, take one more right next to you, right there.
Thank you very much. To add two things, and ask a couple of questions. One is that it's our Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations that is in charge of putting together all the ideas you bring to the table and drafting the first version of what will be the outcome document for Rio. And because of that, our department is very sensitive to the many positions that governments have. And if I understand correctly, one of the big issues that is now dividing governments, and of course UNEP has a big role to play in that, is that many countries are not buying the goodness of the green economy. And they're fearing, especially countries in the developing world, that this is another it's going to represent barriers for growth because it would imply that developed countries will put barriers to trade. I'm very happy that USAID was talking about how to eliminate those. And also that there are already existing and very important barriers to the transfer of technology, which the lady from Vale very rightly pointed out, that it's not only access to credit, but if the middle medium-sized businesses cannot get to the right technology because of barriers of property, intellectual property rights. That also constrains the process. So could you comment what to say about that? The other thing that I think Rio is going to be very important on is that we mentioned yesterday that in 2015, the UN and the whole system is going to look again about what to do once the MDGs are reached or not reached. And the MDGs have been great for health, probably education, but there's an MDG 8 that has to do with sustainability that is extremely vague and really doesn't have any teeth. So I think that one important thing you have to keep in mind is how to make some indicators that are not too complex, but that would be relevant to pick up in 2015, because I think that would be the best way of maintaining the process going through the future. Well, you can comment on that, please.
Okay. Amy, do you want to go ahead and take on the question about green economy and sustainable development?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that question. And that, in fact, I think you were referring to recently there was a meeting of the Commission on Sustainable Development where this really came up very strongly. And what we've been finding is it depends. Some developing countries are embracing the green economy, and some are fearful about what you've laid out, which is, could this be another conditionality scenario where, how green is your economy, how green is your product, but that's about national policies and what countries do in terms of setting standards on trade and so forth. The green economy what we're trying to show is the benefits to countries by moving in that direction. It's about making the economic case that there is a profit to be made that's better for the bottom line. And I think we have to look at it in those terms. And there's many, many examples from the developing world. I just gave a few, but they're all over the map. I mean, it's just incredible. And so I think actually bringing some of the case studies from your company, for example, would be very helpful. And I'm hoping that at Rio there will be some kind of a forum for demonstrating how this is beneficial, not only for this environment, but for the bottom line. It is really hard to go from the macro case down to that level. But one thing we're very encouraged by is that we've had so much demand after we've released our report from countries at the national level. We've also been talking with the IMF and the IDB and others saying, look, we want to put our money in a place that will have these results. How do we go about that? Can you help us do the analysis at the national level to figure out how, for this country, what's the right mix of investment to get there? So it needs to be very tailored to the situation, and I hope we can get past the typical polemic of the debates that sometimes occur in the UN, sort of us versus them, and we look at this in a more, we need to do this together if we're going to survive on the planet.
Yeah, on the MDGs, Hanya, I'm grateful you asked about this. I have a feeling that we know pretty much the answer to the question what we need to do. The key is to have good answers to the question how. So I think looking at the MDGs, which are to be achieved by 2015, or realistically they will not be achieved on several counts. Maybe the education goal will be achieved. Hopefully the water. Definitely not sanitation. Definitely not child mortality and maternal health, as it looks now. Then I think we need to look at, of course, what is unfulfilled, but then I think we need to work in a more holistic manner. Bring in the other aspects. You mentioned some of them yourselves, and we have brought it out here. Technology transfer, agriculture, trade, ODA, of course, which is going down. And shouldn't forget also good governance aspects. All these issues have to bring in around the problem, and also have a way post-2015 to mobilize the relevant actors, those who can influence the problems, the ones that we have talked about at length here at this panel, to have a more dynamic, inclusive approach. This would be my hope. I would also personally go for a 5-year goal instead of a 15-year extension. 15 years sort of makes people, well, we'll wait. It takes a long time before we get there. I think 5 years is a more demanding time frame.
Kit, you want want to take on the climate change question?
Sure. With respect to, dealing with climate change, the fossil fuel question that you raised is all about mitigation, and we need to make sure that we're making the transition to lower emitting and zero emitting electricity and fuel sources. And so necessarily that means moving on a pathway towards less consumption of fossil fuels as part of our energy mix. And so it's not something that we can just turn off without making that more gradual transition at this moment. There are lots of plans out there for how to be doing this as quickly as possible, and certainly enabling policy environment is a very important component of that. And that's something that we're working on at USAID, both in terms of our clean energy investments, our efficiency investments, and then also from the carbon sequestration side of things, our sustainable landscapes investments. So, yes, we need to be moving on that pathway.
And I would add only that there is already discussion going on internationally about setting a target for when we would be completely off of fossil fuels. And there have been some studies and some proposals talking about setting a target of 100% renewables by 2050. So I think this is going to be an issue that will clearly be discussed in the year going to the next Earth Summit. I think it's important that we do have a long-term vision of a low-carbon green economy that's articulated and agreed to at Rio, but at the same time, it really needs to be combined with very, very short-term and specific commitments in order to get people to actually start acting on what we need to do. On Volley, do you want to respond to that? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yawn.
Yes, the source of our inspiration or the source of our attitude. Yes, I can say that, first of all, our CEO highly supports all the sustainable actions. I can even say that when he took over the position last month, he mentioned to the employees that, well, I want us to be very profitable, yes, but I want you people to be able to go home, be happy, to see your kids, to help them doing homework. And I mentioned this to you because in our country or in our company, normally people stay up very late doing the work. So they don't go home until sometimes 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So, and he mentioned that to us. He said, I want you to be able to go home and see your kids before they go to bed. That's a very sustainable attitude, I believe. So this is just one example when he gave his speech. But then I think the challenge that we have from the sustainability department, because of course all my team in the sustainability department are very supportive of the green economy and everything, of course. And I think the challenge we have is to inspire also the other teams, the financial guys, the engineers, everybody, to have the same approach, the same perspective. And that's a daily job. When I think every day we need to think we have this challenge ahead of us. We need to make sure everybody thinks the right direction, the right way.
We're approaching 10 o'clock, so could I call for maybe one more question all the way in the back?
Hi, Hari Srinivasan. It might be perhaps a rude question, but there's an underlying assumption that these global meetings matter. Are there any metrics that prove that there is some sort of effectiveness 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out when large stakeholders walk away? We don't seem to have any teeth that go with it. There aren't any cost penalties. So I'm glad that countries can come together, and I'm all for communication, but I'm really, all of you have talked eloquently about the impact, and I'm just trying to figure out, are there any metrics that prove that next year we're actually going to be able to show some result a year after that, 2 years after that?
I'm going to let Amy start.
Oh, thank you.
I
think that's a great question. I think maybe it's even the elephant in the room, so thanks for asking that. And I'm very optimistic and strongly believe in the role of the UN, and not just the UN, but the need for other multilateral institutions. As imperfect as it sometimes seems, there's nothing else. We need something to bring nations together to have the conversation. But as we've been talking about on this panel, that can't end there. There's definitely examples of successes in the UN and UNEP, where I work. For example, some specifics on the Partnership for Cleaner Fuels and Vehicles was launched at the World Summit. That's what brought together governments, international organizations, the World Bank, industry, NGOs to phase out first lead and gasoline, which we've almost done globally since Johannesburg. We're now working on low sulfur fuels, lowering that amount. We were just in Kenya, where the energy minister, along with the environment minister, we did a launching of their commitment to lower sulfur in their fuels in Kenya. So it's not just about the developed world doing that. And now we're looking at carbon through that partnership. Just one example. It's frustrating. I think like any process, it's complex. It doesn't happen overnight. It's sometimes zigs and zags as opposed to having a direct result. But I think we need to look at this again as a contribution to the path towards a green economy and to sustainable development. It certainly is not going to solve all the problems. We need to have engagement from every sector of society.
Let me just... Okay, go ahead.
Certain international agreements are easy to follow up in terms of accountability. Disarmament agreements are usually pretty good, trade agreements also. But some areas, of course, are pointing in directions, and then everything depends on how much the nation state wants to deliver. And this is this contradiction we have with the very strong accountability systems, the democratic infrastructures in our countries which bring in that element at home. But we don't have that yet on the international level. And there are those even who are fighting for the international bodies to have that power. So I think we need to understand that it is basically going back to the member states. And my job in this group with Millennium Development Group advocates is to simply remind the leaders of the world and public opinion that all these promises were made the year 2000 to be achieved by 2015. And it is, again, very disappointing to notice that some of them don't even remember those promises.
This is an excellent question. In 1993, my organization, Natural Resources Defense Council, undertook the first sort of systematic country-by-country survey of what the impact of the Earth Summit was. And what we found is that these meetings do generate a tremendous amount of political will on the part of national governments, quite often governments at the state and local level, stimulates a lot of activity on the part of corporations, and also in the case of 1992 and the Earth Summit, really inspired a lot of people to get engaged and involved in the field in the first place. And so so we've been able to document the fact that these meetings, not only I mentioned Rio, also Johannesburg, and indeed even Copenhagen, really did stimulate a lot of activity. The problem is I think as you got a sense from this conversation, when you talk about sustainability, when you talk about climate change, you're talking about an extraordinarily wide range of activities. And the problem then is how do you create a metric which sort of covers all of those activities? And I think one of the problems we've run into sometimes, we've had a tendency to try and simplify the metrics a little bit, to the point that we run into the problem, for example, we only talk about reductions of CO2 emissions, which sort of has a tendency, and I think Yawn alluded to this, that sort of masks the complexity of the challenge of making the transition to a green economy, which is what this is really all about. Did I get the final word? Yep. Okay, well, listen, let me thank all of you for your patience and for your attention and for your questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent presentation.